So let's look at the basic tenets, the basic theoretical assumptions of realist international political economy. First of all, for all realists, be it international relations scholars or scholars of international political economy, the concept of power is central. Power politics is seen as a constant in international relations, including international economic relations. But whereas realist IR scholars, international relations scholars or security studies scholars usually focus on the military aspects of power and politics, realist political economists emphasize the economic aspects. They are interested in the struggle among states for economic resources, for economic power, and the economic strategies that states use to further their national interests. States are seen to be in a perennial struggle with each other, competing with each other, which is why economic realists are hardly surprised when economic cooperation proves difficult. The view is certainly more pessimistic than that of economic liberals. The basic assumption that economic realists make, just like political realists, is that the international system is anarchic because there is no central authority above states. There's no world government. This means that competition and conflict are an ever-present danger, and that each state must look after its own national economic interests. For economic realists, then, national self-reliance and economic resilience becomes much more important than for liberals who have more of an optimistic view of international economic relations, and for whom national self-reliance and economic resilience means economic efficiency losses. Economic self-reliance and resilience usually mean economic costs. Economically, it's usually more efficient to rely on others for supplies which may be costly to produce oneself, or which one doesn't have oneself. Realists, however, stress that relying on others, becoming dependent on others, involves risks and makes states vulnerable to strategic extortion. This is also why economic realists put much emphasis on the state imperative of national autonomy, so the need to avoid to become dependent on others, particularly other states, but it may also involve foreign corporations and markets to some extent. For realists, then, it is the state that is the main unit of analysis, because the state is seen as the main actor in international political economy. States are important for the functioning of the international political economy, for international economic relations. At the same time, the state is variably constrained by both international and domestic structures, and that is of great interest to economic realists, who see the state as constantly trying to struggle for its own autonomy, for its ability to act independently from international and domestic forces, such as transnational cooperation and domestic economic interest groups. We can compare this view of the state with liberals who put little emphasis on state autonomy. Economic liberals often see the state as having little autonomy from domestic economic interest groups. Instead, they view the states as a function of these domestic interest groups, and state action as largely following from which particular domestic interest groups get to run the state. So economic policymaking will then mirror these domestic interests to a large extent. Structuralists then, on the other hand, usually also see a little room for autonomous state action. In their view, it is transnational capital, transnational corporation that run the show, and states besides the hegemonic state have little room for independent action. For economic realists, these views of both structuralists and liberals are too simplistic. For economic realists, the state is not just the pawn of either external or internal interests, but has interests of its own, as defined by policymakers and bureaucrats, and in whose interest it is to fight for the ability to act independently. However, this ability will very much vary between different states. States are not equal in their ability to act independently. States like China or the US is far less constrained in their economic policymaking by international structures than small countries, for instance. The US and China are much less dependent on other countries than smaller countries are on the US and China, which gives US and China much more leeway in economic policymaking. And with their big internal markets, they can be self-sufficient for many goods and resources, where smaller countries will have to rely on international markets to get access to many vital goods and resources. An interesting question is to what extent US policymakers compared with Chinese policymakers are able to act independently of their own domestic interests, such as big companies. In China, with its state capitalist system, the state probably controls domestic cooperation to a higher degree than in the US with its more market capitalist system. This is also the sort of thing that economic realists take an interest in, the relations between states and firms, state-business relations, because these relations are assumed to affect the state's ability to act independently and ability to carry through its economic strategies, firms being the main interlocutors for economic strategies. A major difference between economic realists and liberals concern their perspectives on international economic relations, especially economic interdependence. Liberals have traditionally put great faith in globalization and economic interdependence. Liberals argue that as states open up their economies and specialization take effect, not only will economic efficiency improve, but states will also come to abandon power politics in favor of cooperation and integration into liberal rules-based order. So from this perspective, globalization has created a global division of labor, which generates global supply chains, and this in turn creates economic efficiency by eliminating redundancy and gives rise to this tangled web of economic interdependencies that rules out coercive strategies. When states are economically dependent on each other, they will not fight with each other, because that would mean sort of shooting oneself in the foot. So from this liberal or neoliberal perspective, it becomes imperative for states to connect to the flows of goods, resources, capital, and data that are crisscrossing the globe. These global flows create opportunities for businesses and societies at large. So the underlying assumption that liberals make is that higher connectivity and interdependence fosters synergies and economies of scale, benefiting the parties involved proportionally to their participation. This global interconnectivity, liberals argue, has rendered policy solutions that focus on strengthening economic resilience and self-sufficiency ineffective and obsolete, liberals argue. So for some liberals, even critical infrastructure is seen to benefit from being globally spread in order to maximize cost efficiencies provided by the global value chains. So the image here becomes one of sort of complex interdependence, in which states are woven together by reciprocal dependencies with not only productivity gains, but also broader pacifying effects for the international system at large. Now, this is a view that economic realists criticize for overlooking the risks involved with abandoning economic autonomy in favor of interdependence and connectivity. On the one hand, economic realists argue these risks are systemic, including disruptions in the global supply chains and financial markets, as well as illicit trade flows such as narcotics. To economic realists, the financial crisis of 2008 bore witness to some of those risks that had to do with these entangled financial markets. The COVID-19 pandemic also showed how global supply chains may come in for disruptions, causing great havoc. We saw shortages of vital materials such as face masks and vaccines in many parts of the world. And these are but the most perhaps obvious examples. But the COVID-19 pandemic also caused disruptions in many other supply chains, technology equipment, building material, even food in some parts of the world. Climate change may also cause further disruptions and other disruptions. And of course, the war in Ukraine has caused disruptions in many vital resource flows, such as grain and energy flows, with huge negative repercussions in many countries dependent on those supplies. These supply chain disruptions show how there are systemic risks involved for states with being dependent on global supply chains, risks that stem from globalization and its inherent economic interdependencies, as, as at least the economic realists argue in that way. On the other hand, economic realists also point to risks that are related to the asymmetric aspects of interdependence and the way this entails a source of power in bargaining relationships between states. In contradiction to liberal claims, economic realists argue that increasing interdependence and connectivity has not produced a so-called flat world of more symmetric power relations and cooperation. Instead, economic interdependence tends to generate ever more asymmetric dependencies that can be manipulated, exploited, and weaponized for strategic leverage by the less vulnerable parties in these relationships. In such a situation of competitive interdependence or weaponized interdependence, as some would call it these days, states that fail to consider relative gains run the risk of having their strategic autonomy circumscribed and by extension become sort of pawns in the game of power politics. Economic realists therefore stress how states need to balance against too much economic dependence, especially with regard to strategic resources such as oil or critical technology or even water in some parts of the world. Resources, when exclusively in foreign hands, can be used for extortion, realists argue. So for economic realists, economic interdependencies carry with them possible vulnerabilities for states, and it is therefore important for states to manage its interdependencies so as not to put itself at risk to that sort of strategic extortion. We can think of the current situation between Russia and Europe, in which Europe's energy dependence on Russia has put the EU and especially perhaps Germany in a very difficult situation. Germany, having overlooked, perhaps at least as what economic realists would claim, the risks with its Russian energy dependence, is now suffering from not having diversified its energy flows. On the other hand, the EU and the US is trying to use Russia's dependence on Western technologies, for instance, and capital as levers of economic warfare, sanctioning Russian access to critical technology and capital. This then also creates a possible economic security dilemma in the absence of a central authority above states, in the circumstances of anarchy, as we earlier pointed out, because the actions that a state takes to make itself less dependent on another state and more economically resilient and secure will affect other states' economic security, lessening their access to critical resources and technologies. Suddenly, they are being cut out from critical goods and resources that their industrial production might rely on and their societies might rely on. So in view of these risks and vulnerabilities inherent with economic interdependence, economic realists see states as being mostly concerned with relative gains and their position vis-a-vis other states. This realist emphasis on relative gain stems from the view that international relations is a zero-sum game in which one state's gains equals another state's loss. Liberals, by contrast, focus on absolute gains. They believe states mostly focus on maximizing their own gains and are less concerned about the gain of others. So liberals see a variable sum game in which states may gain or lose together. This is a much more optimistic view than that of realists. Liberals and realist views of international institutions exemplify this difference in outlook, whereas liberals see the IMF, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization as benefiting all states adhering to their liberal economic principles. Realists see these international organizations as arenas for acting power relationships, in which the most powerful states shape the rules to fit their own national own interests. International economic organizations are therefore arenas for these economic power struggles and contests as well, where states try to shape the rule of the game in their own favor, and mostly to the favor of stronger states. What is probably important to understand is that for economic realists, politics takes precedence over economics. This contrasts with structuralists and liberals who see economics as taking precedence over politics. So economic are the driving force in that sense. For economic realists, the state is in the driver's seat, and its prime interest is survival and the ability to act independently. Economics is instrumental to those larger and more basic goals. Markets are therefore also a creation of the state, when it is in the state interest to create markets. When it is not, the state closes the market and usually has the power to do so in economic realist thought. It is politics and political interest that drives economics, not the other way around. And because economic realists see the state as focusing on relative gains rather than mutual or absolute gains, the state will need to intervene in the economy. The state will need to shape the market forces to its own interest, to its own gain, and it does so, of course, in competition with all other states. So international economic relations is really an arena for the competition for relative economic power. That is why we see so much subsidies for local industry. We see the data localization requirements. We have foreign investment screening mechanisms, export controls to prevent homegrown high technology to end up in foreign hands and out of state control. We just have to witness the competition over technological edge these days between the United States and China playing out right now, with the US trying to prevent China from gaining access to its high technology. For economic realists, the technological competition is the natural outcome of states looking to these sort of relative gains and to secure their position in this competition. In the final analysis, it is about power. And for economic realists, power is essential in determining international economic relations. To get a feeling for how economic realists approach international political economy questions, we can think of the big topic of globalization itself. First, what drives globalization? What explains the move towards a more globalized economy, and what are the effects of globalization? Depending on what school of thought you belong to, you'll probably approach that question a bit differently. For many economic liberals, globalization is driven by technological development. The global flows of capital, goods, resources, and data have been enabled by technological innovation. The internet has enabled the global flow of massive amount of data and the digitalization of the economy. The creation of the container has arguably been instrumental in allowing for the massive increase in world trade. The global financial messaging system, the SWIFT, has been instrumental in allowing for global financial transfers. This is also why many economic liberals have viewed globalization as sort of an unstoppable force. There's no going back on technological progress, which is why globalization, according to many liberals, will not reverse either. Economic realists see it differently, because they put the state at the center of their analysis. According to economic realists, it is the state that has been driving globalization, because it has been in the interest of powerful states to do so, such as the United States. So when globalization no longer is in the interest of these powerful states, globalization will be reversed. The EU and the US have been opening their markets to other states, not only because they have profited from it economically, but also because this way they have been able to bind up other countries, to their own institutions, norms, and rules. So from an economic realist perspective, the so-called liberal international order has in reality been a Western-led international order, through which chiefly the US, but also the EU, have been able to lock in their rules and norms for the international order by attracting other countries with sort of economic carrots to join it, by opening up their markets to others, and through that lock in these other weaker states into the Western-led order. So underpinning globalization have been the politico-strategic aims of chiefly Western states. As long as these states perceive themselves to be benefiting from globalization, globalization went on. But when that perception changes, globalization will hit into trouble. And a lot of what has happened over the last 5 to 10 years can seem to bear out this analysis. After the Trump administration and continuing rise of economic protectionism around the world ever since, globalization no longer look really inevitable, but is sort of reversing in many ways. Another example that economic realists see as vindicating their case is COVID-19 and the borders, how they started to close down following the COVID-19 outbreak, and how it showed how citizens ultimately looked to their national governments for protection. Indeed, the scramble for medical resources following the spread of the new coronavirus and the lack of cooperation even among EU member states, many economic realists take as vindicating their case about the centrality of states in international political economy. Economic realists posits that although globalization has made many non-state actors influential in global politics, states remain the central actors also in the contemporary world. These realists envision a world of continuous competition among states for scarce resources in a context of international anarchy. And this assumption of anarchy, that is the absence of a centralized authority to which states can appeal for protection, that means that when push comes to shove, states are essentially self-help agents pursuing self-help strategies. And recent developments economic realists posit show precisely that. For economic realists, that states continue to have authority despite globalization, and that they are motivated to preserve that authority and autonomy will then also mean that economic governance will not necessarily converge around the world, so that all states would adopt similar market capitalist models, as liberals often argue. Instead, economic realists argue we will see a variety of capitalist models, some more state-oriented than others more free market-oriented, depending on their own state interests relating to the international economic order. Especially countries in the development phase will adopt more state capitalist models to protect themselves from the free market and maximize their ability to act independently. So from the perspective of economic realism, state capitalism, for instance, of the variant that China is applying, is then quite natural, and it would have been naive to expect it to adopt the market capitalist model of the West. In fact, China, according to economic realists, have been able to exploit the openness of Western markets to its own benefit by the use of state capitalist measures such as subsidizing its own companies and through its strategic investments in many foreign markets, acquiring control of many strategic resources. For economic realists, then, China has just been following economic realist doctrine, and through that been able to outdo in many ways its Western competitors, who have been in certain ways naive in their economic liberalism.